In 1967, an Iranian criminal network operating out of Tehran made a decision that they believed would force Bumpy Johnson to his knees. They took his daughter. They believed distance would protect them. They did not account for the possibility that he would simply get on a plane. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson was born in 1905 in Charleston, South Carolina, and arrived in Harlem as a teenager during the height of the Great Migration. He came with nothing identifiable as an advantage: no money, no family connections, no established name. What he had was a quality that people who knew him described consistently across decades. He was the calmest man in any room, at any temperature. He built his reputation in Harlem's criminal underworld through the 1920s and 1930s, at a time when the neighborhood's rackets, numbers, gambling, narcotics, loan operations were generating serious money and attracting serious violence. He came up through the organization of Stephanie St. Clair, known throughout Harlem as Madame Queen, one of the most formidable operators the neighborhood had produced. She recognized in Johnson something beyond physical capability. He could read a situation 3 moves ahead and remain composed while doing it. His name was made through his conflict with Dutch Schultz. Schultz was a white, organized crime figure from the Bronx who, in the early 1930s, moved into Harlem's numbers operation with force. He did not ask. He arrived with violence and the expectation that existing operators would bend. Most did. Bumpy Johnson did not. The war that followed lasted years. It cost lives on both sides. And it ended with Schultz, one of the most feared men in New York organized crime at that moment, negotiating a shared arrangement with a black operator from Harlem who had refused to concede an inch. That outcome defined Johnson's standing in the underworld for the rest of his life. He had taken on the most dangerous man in New York and made him compromise. Federal narcotics charges sent him to prison multiple times across the 1940s and 1950s. Each return to Harlem was a return to the same position. His authority did not erode in his absence because it was not built on constant physical presence. It was built on something more durable: the neighborhood's understanding that Bumpy Johnson's word held, that his territory had boundaries, and that those boundaries were not theoretical. By the mid-1960s, he was one of the most recognized criminal figures in the United States. Federal investigators had files on him spanning decades. Journalists had written about him. Harlem residents who had no involvement in his world still spoke his name with a specific weight. He was, in the clearest sense, a man whose reputation had become institutional. He was also a father. His daughter Elise was the part of his life that existed entirely outside the world that made him who he was. He kept that separation deliberately. The people he dealt with in business understood, without being told explicitly, that his family was a boundary that did not exist for negotiation. The Iranian network that entered New York in 1966 either did not know this, or decided it did not matter. The international heroin trade in the 1960s ran along a pipeline that American federal investigators had been mapping for years. Raw opium from the poppy fields of Iran and Turkey moved west, was processed into heroin in laboratories in southern Turkey, France, and Lebanon, and then distributed onward into Western Europe and the United States. The American end of that pipeline terminated primarily in New York, and within New York, the highest value retail markets were in the urban neighborhoods, Harlem above all others. The Iranian criminal networks operating along this pipeline were not street-level organizations. They were sophisticated commercial operations with connections to legitimate business structures, banking channels in multiple countries, and relationships with law enforcement and political figures that provided operational cover. They managed supply chains across continents with the organizational discipline of import-export businesses, which in a functional sense was exactly what they were. By 1966, one of these networks had identified a specific opportunity in New York. Rather than continuing to supply product to established distributors at wholesale prices, they saw the possibility of establishing direct distribution relationships within Harlem, cutting out the intermediary layer and capturing the additional margin for themselves. The economics were compelling. The risk they were underestimating was the organizational reality on the ground. Their initial entry was quiet. So product began moving through channels that existed outside the established structure. New distributors, new street-level operations, pricing that undercut existing arrangements. The disruption was incremental enough that it was designed to establish roots before the existing power structure fully registered what was happening. What they had assessed correctly was the market. What they had assessed incorrectly was the man. Bumpy Johnson became aware of the network's activities within weeks of their first moves in Harlem. His information came from multiple directions: distributors who had been approached, associates who had noticed product moving through unfamiliar channels, street-level observers whose job it was to notice exactly these kinds of changes. And the picture that assembled itself was of a foreign operation moving into his territory without introduction, without negotiation, and without any apparent interest in either. He made contact through intermediaries. The message he sent was clear and direct: this stops, or it is stopped. The response he received from the network's representatives communicated two things simultaneously. First, that they had received the message. Second, that they did not intend to comply with it. That exchange was the beginning of a sequence of events that would end in Tehran. The network's counteroffer arrived through the same intermediary channel Johnson had used to make initial contact. It was structured as a business proposal. They were prepared to offer Johnson a financial arrangement, a monthly payment, framed as a consultant's fee, in exchange for his non-interference in their Harlem operations. The number was significant. By any ordinary measure, it was a serious offer. Johnson's response, relayed back through the same channel, was a single sentence: Harlem was not available for purchase. The network's leadership, operating from Tehran, appears to have processed this response as a negotiating position rather than a final answer. In their experience with American criminal operators, an initial refusal of a financial offer was standard procedure, a signal that the number needed to go higher, not that the conversation was over. They came back with a revised figure. It was substantially larger than the first. Johnson did not respond to the second offer. In the operational language he had used throughout his career, silence after a stated position was not ambiguity, as it was confirmation. Several weeks passed without further contact. During that period, the network did not slow its activity in Harlem. If anything, the product flow increased, which was either a demonstration of confidence or an attempt to create facts on the ground that would force a different conversation. Johnson's organization applied what pressure it could, disrupting street-level distribution, cutting off distributors who had taken the network's product, communicating clearly to anyone within his reach that the arrangement was not sanctioned. None of it reached the source. The source was in Tehran, and it continued operating without interruption. The network's leadership had by this point developed a working theory of the situation. Johnson was a local operator whose power was bounded by his geography, and he could make their work in Harlem difficult. He could not reach them. That gap between what he could do in New York and what he could not do across an ocean was the foundation of their confidence. Then they made a decision that collapsed that theory entirely. Accounts passed through Johnson's inner circle, and later gathered by researchers in the years following his death, indicate that the kidnapping of his daughter was not impulsive. It was discussed and authorized at the leadership level as a mechanism to force compliance. They believed it would work. They were making a calculation about what kind of man Bumpy Johnson was. They were wrong. Elise Johnson was taken in the spring of 1967. The operation was executed with the precision that indicated professional planning rather than improvisation. She was not taken from Harlem. She was taken in circumstances that reflected careful surveillance of her movements outside the neighborhood, at a location and time that minimized the likelihood of witnesses who would connect the event to any known party. The men who carried out the abduction were not members of any New York criminal organization. They were brought in specifically for the operation, which meant there were no street-level informants who could identify them, no established relationships that could be traced backward, and no local trail that Johnson's people could follow through the channels they controlled. By the time Johnson was informed, Elise was already outside the United States. The message that arrived with news of the abduction was precise in its construction. Elise was unharmed, and she would remain unharmed as long as Johnson concluded his interference in the network's Harlem operations and accepted the financial arrangement that had previously been offered. The network's leadership communicated confidence that the situation would resolve itself quickly. They had, in their assessment, removed every other option available to him. Johnson received this information in Harlem, in the presence of two of his most trusted associates. Accounts of that moment described the same thing. He did not raise his voice. He did not move from his chair. He sat for a long time without speaking, and when he did speak, he asked a specific set of questions. Where exactly was she? Who was holding her? What building, what city, what level of the network's hierarchy was directly responsible? He wanted the operational details, not the political framework. His associates did not have all of those answers immediately. He told them to get the answers. He gave them 48 hours. What the network had expected was that the abduction would produce paralysis or compliance, or both. What it produced was the opposite. Johnson had spent his entire adult life operating in an environment where threats were real and consequences were physical. He had faced Dutch Schultz. He had faced federal prosecution. He had faced rivals who wanted him dead and had the capability to attempt it. He was familiar with the experience of being in a position where the options available to him were narrower than he would have chosen. His response in those situations had always been the same. He assessed what he could actually do, discarded what he could not, and moved on the remaining options with complete attention. The network had taken his daughter to create leverage. What they had actually done was give him a destination. 48 hours later, his associates returned with the information he had asked for. Elise was being held in Tehran, in a property controlled by a senior figure within the network's leadership structure. The man responsible for authorizing the abduction was in the same city. Johnson listened to the full report. Then he told them to arrange a flight. The hours between Johnson receiving that information and his departure from New York were handled with a discipline that reflected how completely he understood operational security. The number of people informed of what he intended to do was kept to an absolute minimum. Those who were told were given only what they needed to know to fulfill a specific function during his absence. His organization in Harlem was given instructions that covered the period he expected to be gone. Operations would continue at the same level. No escalation, no public response to the kidnapping, no communication to the network or to anyone connected to them that indicated what Johnson was planning. From the outside, Harlem would appear to be holding, a man waiting for the situation to develop, assessing his options, perhaps moving toward compliance. That appearance was the strategy. The network was monitoring Harlem. They were watching for signs of what Johnson would do. If his street operations remained calm, they would read it as the situation stabilizing in their favor. Oh, they would not be looking at an airport departure manifest. Harlem itself, the neighborhood, the community, the people who knew Johnson and whose lives intersected with his world in various ways, knew that something serious had happened. The specific details did not travel widely. What traveled was the atmosphere. People who had spent their lives in Harlem reading the temperature of the street knew that the current silence was not ordinary. It had weight to it. The people closest to Johnson operated in that silence with the professional steadiness he had modeled for them across decades. There was no visible panic, no public searching, no approach to law enforcement. Going to the police was not a structure Johnson had ever worked within, and it was not a structure available to him now. Now, the federal agencies that had spent years investigating him would not function as instruments of help. The NYPD had no jurisdiction in Tehran. He had one instrument available: himself. The associates who drove him to the airport the following morning did not know whether they would see him again. That possibility had been present in varying degrees throughout their years, working alongside him. They had learned over time not to express it. Johnson had never found uncertainty to be a useful emotion, and he had very little patience for its performance in others. He shook hands with each of them. Then he walked through the terminal alone. The decision Johnson made was not simply to travel to Tehran. That part was straightforward, once the destination was known. The decision was about what he intended to do when he arrived, and what he was prepared to do if the situation required it. He was 61 years old. He was operating under periodic federal surveillance. He had a criminal record that spanned 3 decades. He was traveling to a foreign country where he had no network, no allies, no legal standing, and no protection of any kind. The people he was going to confront were senior figures in an international criminal organization who had already demonstrated their willingness to take the kind of action most operators treat as a final resort. He had examined those facts with the same analytical clarity he applied to every serious situation in his career. They did not change the conclusion. His daughter was in Tehran. He was going to Tehran. The rest was details. What the network could not have modeled in any of their calculations about Bumpy Johnson was the specific combination of attributes that had defined his career. His reputation was built on his refusal to respond to pressure in the way that pressure was designed to produce. Every operator who had attempted to move him, Schultz, federal prosecutors, rivals within Harlem's own underworld, had constructed their approach around the assumption that sufficient force or sufficient incentive would produce the result they wanted. None of them had produced that result. Not one, across 40 years. The network's leadership in Tehran had studied the situation with intelligence and without wisdom. They knew his name, his history, his criminal record, his organizational position in Harlem. What they had not absorbed was the pattern embedded in all of that information. Every attempt to force Bumpy Johnson into a position he had not chosen had ended the same way, with Bumpy Johnson doing the thing they had calculated he could not do. He chose what he needed to bring. He traveled light. A leather briefcase, a change of clothes, the specific information his associates had gathered about the address where Elise was being held, and the identity of the man responsible. He did not bring anything he would need to explain at a customs inspection. He did not need to. His leverage was not a weapon. It was his name, and what his presence in that city, at that door, was going to communicate before he said a single word. The flight from Idlewild Airport in New York to Tehran in 1967 was not a direct route, and it required a connection through Europe, London, Frankfurt, or Rome, depending on the carrier and the schedule. The total travel time was the better part of a day. Johnson sat through that transit in the manner of a man who had decided on a course of action and found waiting for it to begin more irritating than the action itself. He had traveled internationally before, though not frequently. The experience of being a Black American man with a federal criminal record moving through international airports in 1967 carried its own specific texture. The era's racial dynamics were visible at every customs counter and airline desk. Johnson had navigated racial hostility in New York since his arrival as a teenager in the 1920s. It had never slowed him, and it did not slow him now. He attracted no attention that was specifically dangerous. So a well-dressed Black American man traveling alone through European transit hubs was not a profile that activated any particular alarm on either side of the law. Federal investigators in New York did not know he had left the country. The network in Tehran did not know he was coming. That asymmetry, his knowledge of the destination against Brat, their complete unawareness of his movement, was the only structural advantage he carried into the situation, and he had manufactured it deliberately through the operational silence he had imposed on Harlem in the days before his departure. He landed at Mehrabad International Airport in Tehran in the daytime. The city spread out below the aircraft's approach, vast, sprawling, the Alborz Mountains rising behind it to the north, the desert opening in every other direction. It was a city of several million people, a capital in the middle of rapid modernization, operating on its own rhythms and within its own power structures. None of those structures knew that Bumpy Johnson had just arrived. He cleared customs, collected his briefcase, and walked out of the terminal. Tehran in 1967 was a city in active transformation under Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi's modernization program. Western hotels, commercial districts, and government ministries sat alongside traditional bazaars, covered markets, and the architectural weight of a deeply established Islamic urban culture. American and European business figures were a consistent presence in the city's upper districts. The Shah's economic agenda had made Iran a destination for foreign investment, and the international hotels near the city center reflected that. Johnson checked into one of those hotels. He did not use his own name. He was not carrying documents that would immediately identify him to anyone scanning for a criminal profile out of New York. He was, on the surface of the available information, a well-dressed American businessman in late middle age, present in Tehran for purposes that were his own. He used the first hours in the city to establish the physical reality of the address his associates had provided. In Harlem, he operated with the knowledge of every street, every building, every person of significance within his geography. Tehran was the opposite, entirely unfamiliar terrain where he could not read the environment with the instinctive fluency he relied on at home. He moved carefully. He observed more than he acted. So the property where Elise was being held was in a residential district south of the city's main commercial center. It belonged to a senior member of the network, a man whose legitimate business interests provided the public face of his operations, and whose actual authority within the criminal hierarchy was significant. He was not a street operator. He was an executive. He made decisions from positions of security and controlled access. What he did not have, on the afternoon that Bumpy Johnson appeared at the outer gate of that property, was any warning that the confrontation was coming. The account of this moment, passed through Johnson's inner circle and gathered by researchers in subsequent years, describes the reception at the gate as a collision between two completely different operational realities. The men at the gate were prepared for the full range of situations that might arise in their principal's world. They were not prepared for a black American man in a dark tailored suit and a wide-brimmed fedora standing at the entrance of a Tehran residential compound, asking in measured English to speak with the man inside about a matter concerning his daughter. The request was specific enough and delivered with sufficient calm that it traveled up the chain. Several minutes passed. Then the gate opened. Johnson walked in. The man who received Johnson was, by the accounts that subsequently circulated, genuinely unprepared for the encounter, not in the sense of being physically surprised, but in the sense of being confronted with a reality his calculations had not produced. But he had authorized the abduction of Elise Johnson as a mechanism to close a business dispute efficiently. The mechanism had been designed to operate through distance. The target was supposed to remain in New York, absorb the pressure, and eventually accept the terms. The target was standing in his home in Tehran. The room where they met was furnished in the manner of a prosperous Tehran merchant's private reception space. Ornate rugs, carved furniture, a tea service, artifacts that communicated wealth and establishment. It was a room designed to conduct business from a position of advantage. Johnson sat in it as if he had chosen the location himself. He did not open with threats. He did not perform anger. He opened with information. He told the man across from him what he knew: the address, the details of the abduction, the specific names of the individuals who had carried it out, the communication channels the network had used to deliver their terms to Harlem. He laid this out in sequence, without commentary, the way a man presents evidence rather than an argument. The purpose of this opening was clear to anyone with experience in these kinds of negotiations. He was establishing that he had done his preparation. He was communicating that the operational security the network believed it had maintained was, in fact, his information. And he was demonstrating that he had made the journey from New York to Tehran in possession of all of this, alone, which meant the network's assessment of his options had been wrong at the foundation. The man across from him listened without interruption. When Johnson finished the factual summary, so there was a period of silence. Then the Iranian began to speak. Initially, in the register of a man who still believes his position has not fundamentally changed, citing the terms of the original offer, the business rationale, the argument that Johnson's cooperation would be financially rewarding. Johnson let him finish. Then he said one thing: he was not in Tehran to negotiate. He was in Tehran to take his daughter home. The only variable in the room was what condition the man across from him wanted to be in after that happened. Accounts of this moment converge on the same detail: the shift in the room's atmosphere after that sentence. The Iranian was an experienced operator. He had conducted dangerous negotiations across multiple continents. He could read a situation. What he read in that moment was a man who had flown from New York to Tehran with no backup, no weapon, and no plan that required the other person's cooperation, and who was completely comfortable with all three of those facts. The network's leverage had been Elise's location. Her location was now known. The threat of violence against her was the remaining instrument, and the man who had authorized her abduction was sitting across a tea table from her father, who had just demonstrated that distance, logistics, and operational complexity were not factors that changed his behavior. The conversation that followed was, by all accounts, relatively brief. Elise Johnson was produced within the hour. She was unharmed, as the network had promised. Johnson looked at her for a long moment. Then he told her they were leaving. He shook the hand of the man across the table. The gesture was formal, final, and carried no warmth whatsoever. They walked out of the compound together. Johnson and his daughter left Tehran within 24 hours of the confrontation. The departure was managed with the same quiet discipline that had characterized the entire operation from the moment he left Harlem. No announcements, no visible security, a car to the airport, a flight west, a connection in Europe, and then the long leg across the Atlantic back to New York. Elise had been held for weeks. The experience of her captivity, the conditions, the communications she had been given or denied, the specific texture of those weeks in Tehran was not something Johnson spoke about publicly, and not something that entered the historical record in any detailed form. What entered the record, through the accounts of people close to both of them, was the quality of the silence between father and daughter on that return journey. It was described as the silence of two people who understood each other completely and found words unnecessary. Johnson landed in New York in the same manner he had left it, without ceremony, without announcement, without anything that drew attention from the federal investigators who monitored his movements when he was in the city. He cleared customs, walked through the terminal, and was driven back to Harlem. His return to the neighborhood carried the same quality his returns from federal prison had always carried. The streets resumed their rhythm. The people who needed to know that things had resolved understood it through the atmosphere before anyone told them explicitly. Bumpy Johnson was back. His daughter was with him. The situation that had briefly created a particular kind of tension in the air had concluded in the only way anyone who knew him well had seriously considered it might. The Iranian network did not extend its direct distribution ambitions into Harlem again. The business rationale that had made Harlem attractive, the potential for higher margin through direct control, remained what it had been. The operational calculation about what pursuing it would cost had been permanently revised. They had attempted to use distance as a weapon against a man who had responded to it by eliminating the distance. There was no version of that exchange they could repeat and expect a different outcome. The territory was closed. The man who closed it had made that clear in person, in their city, but on their ground. The argument was not available for appeal. Bumpy Johnson died on July 7, 1968, at Wells Restaurant on 7th Avenue in Harlem. He was 62 years old. The cause was heart failure. He died at dinner in his neighborhood, in a restaurant he had been visiting for years. He had brought his daughter home from Tehran less than a year before. The arc of that final year, the kidnapping, the flight, the confrontation, the return, is not the kind of story that appears in formal historical documents. It lives in the accounts of people who were close to him, in the oral history of a neighborhood that watched it happen from the edges of its visibility, in the reconstructions of journalists and researchers who have spent subsequent decades assembling what could be assembled. What those accounts establish, when taken together, is a portrait of a man whose character was consistent from his teenage arrival in Harlem to the moment he walked into a compound in Tehran to collect his daughter. The attributes were the same at 61 as they had been at 20. The refusal to accept a constraint he had not chosen. The preference for direct action over prolonged negotiation. The willingness to do personally whatever he had determined needed to be done. Popular accounts of Bumpy Johnson tend to concentrate on his Harlem years. The conflict with Schultz, the relationship with St. Clair, the decades of federal prosecution and survival. Those years are the foundation. The Tehran episode is the conclusion. It is the story of a man whose enemies made a specific calculation about the limits of what he would do. They built that calculation on geography, on age, on a criminal record, on the assumption that some distances are simply too far. He proved each of those assumptions wrong. He did it for his daughter. He did it alone. He did it in 1967 in Tehran. And then he came home.